Soundwave, quickly! Turn it to a tape player and unleash Ravage! Soundwave, what's wrong?
I can't. I'm a non-transforming figure.
Oh, son of a...
You know what's cool about Transformers? It's that they're technically two toys in one. You get a cool articulated robot and another toy on top of that. They can be a vehicle, an animal, some kind of sci-fi craziness. Sometimes they're made of multiple robots. Sometimes they're multiple forms. Sometimes they're a gun. They're great. So it's a little surprising to me that there's a not insignificant market of non-transforming figures out there. And I'm not talking about statues where it makes sense that they'd not be able to transform. I mean, good luck taking that Bashojo Megatron and transforming it, unless you're into Goro. I'm talking about posable figures that simply don't transform, and I have to ask, why? Is there something I'm missing? Am I just stupid? I mean, probably, but that's beside the point. So today, I have 8 figures to see if I can figure out why this market exists. First up, we have Action Masters Prowl. Action Masters was a line by Hasbro during the early 90s, the best era of Transformers, and they were essentially G.I. Joe-sized figures with an emphasis on vehicles and accessories. Funnily enough, some of those vehicles transform. These got a lot of backlash back in the day, and understandably so, because it's the first case of Transformers that didn't transform. But I'm gonna be fair here. These actually make sense for the time. Remember, a lot of the Transformers were very different from their show counterparts, sometimes not even the same character. So it was kind of nice to have something a bit more cartoon accurate back in the day. Prowl isn't the best example because his original toy wasn't too far off, but others weren't so lucky. Also at the time, articulation was very limited on G1 figures, usually arms at best. Whereas using the G.I. Joe style internal O-ring meant that Action Masters have a lot more posability. The arms are only 180-degree rotation with no elbow joints, which is a bit disappointing, but the legs are pretty nice for the time, capable of crab walking, and due to age, you can get some sweet river dancing action. Also, I'll be honest, I kinda dig the stylization. They've been kinda chibi-fied, but not to an extreme extent. They're kinda cute. Sure, nowadays we have way more posable figures that are even more cartoon accurate and that can actually transform. He isn't quite as novel, but for the time, these made sense. And arguably were a step in the right direction with articulation for Transformers. Just look at that spread. Next up is Yolo Park's G1 AMK miniseries model kit Soundwave. God, that's a mouthful. Yolo Park are a name you've probably heard of before, being that they make a ton of model kits for Transformers and even other franchises like Toy Story and Evangelion.
Wait, what the f*** is this kid masturbating?
It's kind of funny because with the stylization, I do get kind of an Action Masters vibe from the look, being more cartoon focused with a bigger head and giant hands. You know what they say about a man with big hands? They can give big slaps. So design-wise, it is nice, and the articulation looks a lot better. So let's have a feel, and the articulation isn't very good on this guy. Like, yeah, you can work with it, but it feels incredibly stiff and heavy in some areas. The head, hands, and feet feel insanely tight, whereas everything else feels fine. Why? And the waist, no thank you. This applies to me low manufacturing tolerance, where the margin of error is a bit higher, meaning that some parts may end up bigger than they should. And while you still can pose him, it feels like you're fighting him. And honestly, this figure is kind of pointless. Because Core Class Soundwave exists, who, yeah, isn't even half the size of the Yolo Park figure, and has no waist pivot, but he's way easier to move about, has his tape door, and I don't know, can actually transform? And this guy is half the price, so sorry Yolo Park, you kinda lost me. Let's see if your Discord kitten can impress me. Now this looks a lot more substantial. This here is Yolo Park's take on Rise of the Beast Cheetor, proudly bragging about having 22 joints of articulation. This is definitely a substantial figure and is even half an inch taller than the Studio Series Voyager Cheetor, with a less bulky chest and saturated coloring scheme. Which granted the coloring they went with in the movie was more washed out, but I'm not the biggest fan of that look, so this is fine by me. And he definitely does look impressive and highly detailed. And you know me, I love the movie design language, so why aren't I feeling it? Well, once again, the articulation heavily lets it down, with some stuff feeling too tight and others being too loose feeling this time around. It's just so gangly feeling at times, like bits are gonna fall off, and sometimes they have. And not helping matters is that it feels incredibly hollow in certain areas, so it feels like it might break, and parts get caught on other parts, particularly the waist and giant shoulder pads. And again, this feels redundant considering the Studio Series figure is roughly the same price with much better plastic, is a lot more solid, and can, you know, transform? Get used to hearing that from me. While we're on the movies, here's a bit of an odd one with Titanium Movie Optimus Prime, and yes, that's the same titanium that brought us Op-Titty Prime and Diaper Wave. See, alongside the deluxe size figures, Galoob produced a series of 3-inch figurines to go along with them. These managed to survive up to the movie, and these aren't aimed to be fully blown figures, so normally I wouldn't talk about them, but when would I ever get a chance to talk about this again? Sculpt-wise, I will say it is remarkably loyal to the films for such a small figure. The colors are on point, all the bits are where they should be. Shoulders are kind of interesting, combining his shoulder spikes with those barrels he has. They kind of remind me of Laser Primes. Unfortunately, in the quest for the size, they opted to leave out a lot of his flames, which is kind of important. You can kind of make some out, but it's such a dark figure, it's hard to see. Also, the face is just a little bit melted, not quite ideal. But there is some articulation in the arms and waist, which is rather nice, though sadly none of the legs, which is a shame because the legs look like they could easily have pulled it off. Speaking of the legs, that's where all the die-cast metal is located, which is a big surprise given it's titanium after all. Even more surprising is that the rest of the plastic is a soft rubbery plastic, which is a little odd to feel because essentially all the weight is in the legs. Also, the rubbery plastic means painting isn't quite as effective, so why not just use hard plastic? I'm not sure. But if this thing wasn't too expensive, let's say $3 or $4, it would have been fine, apart from the face. It's basically a fancy version of one of those dollar store figurines, and I have no beef with those. It's not trying to replace anything. Although maybe it should have replaced the 6-inch figures. Next up is Super 7's reaction figures. I brought up Super 7 before in my Funko Pop video, and essentially they do a lot of retro-themed figures in the style of those old Star Wars figures. And as far as generic collectible figures go, I don't mind them. But Transformers is not the IP I would have chosen. Taking an IP that's, you know, based around toys and making your own version just seems strange. I do dig the box though. It does feel like a 90s action figure box. All it needs is a pointless trading card you'll lose in 2 minutes. And here we have Cheetor, who, yeah, certainly exists. Doing one of these retro 80s Star Wars type figures for the very 90s Beast Wars characters is such a baffling decision, especially given how much Beast Wars was all about big toys with crazy gimmicks and lots of articulation. Meanwhile, all Cheetor can do here is 180-degree arm and leg articulation and turn his head. It's as basic as it gets, and I'm not gonna lie, he's kinda ugly. His yellow fur has become this gross Dijon mustard yellow. The matte blue plastic looks kinda grody, and while I appreciate they wanted to go for cartoon styling, it really doesn't work, especially with a lot of his upper body, which just looks so flat. Also, his expression is like he farted and is trying not to make it too obvious he did it. And again, there's the deluxe War for Cybertron figure, which is a little less accurate to the cartoon and sculpt, but is far more posable, far better styled, and oh yeah, can transform. And that's just one example. There is no shortage of other Cheetors out there, including reissues of his original Beast Wars toy. Do you see the problem with this concept now? Transformers as a franchise has so many figures and so many versions of those figures that there's no need for these things. We can do cartoon accurate sculpts. We can do full posability. A lot of these are flat redundant. But then again, maybe we're approaching this from the wrong angle. Maybe we just need to make them bigger. Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to Age of Extinction Giant Drift. I've brought up before how cool a lot of the movie toy lines were, and leave it to Age of Extinction to ruin that. This was the start of Hasbro dividing up the movie toy lines between a lot of gimmicky garbage and the figures you'd actually want. Something that haunts toy lines for the movies and shows to this day. And while the Generations toys for Age of Extinction were underwhelming for the most part, the stuff aimed at kids were horrible. This is where we got the rise of those awful one-step changers, Titan changers, and a lot of other crap. And here we got this giant drift, which I swear isn't a knockoff, even though he looks like one. He looks like a bath toy. The plastic is so shiny but unpainted, with the worst shade of blue you can imagine, and his face is just a man's face painted gold. They didn't even put his eyes on right. This is not a robot. This is like a cheap samurai doll you find in a flea market for like $2. The back isn't even painted at all. I know these 1-foot figures are a thing for other franchises, but they are not nearly as bad as this. Articulation's standard Star Wars style, albeit with wrist and head articulation. Also, it feels like it's gonna break, which ain't good for a figure aimed at young children. But hey, he has holes in his hands, so maybe we can at least give him his swords. Are you shitting me? You bastards couldn't even give him a sword? Give him a sword, you bumholes! This is worse than Titan Changers. I repeat, these are worse than Titan Changers. I know it's aimed at young children, but there are plenty of Transformers aimed at younger children that have a lot more play value. Also, they aren't tied to a film where a main character talks about how he can legally screw the main character's underage daughter! Can the real drift come in, please? Moving on to Transformers Red, where I just realized the way drift is drawn on the box looks kinda World War II anti-Japanese propaganda-y. Anyhow, moving on to Transformers Red, which is another attempt at non-transforming figures by Hasbro. Think of this as what the Black series is for Star Wars and the Classified series is for G.I. Joe. Semi-affordable 6-inch figures that aim to be screen accurate. Pretty standard, but hey, those lines work great for those franchises, so I opted for Prime RC's figure. Why? Because I wanted to sit on because Prime's design language is infamously hard to translate into figure form. With its unique fusion of toony aesthetics with Bayverse touches, and RC doesn't have the best luck with other figures, so a non-transforming version honestly makes sense. I do have her original figure, and you can see it's a lot more polished up and more accurate to the cartoon, for the most part. Like, there are these weird gold trims in certain areas that she didn't have in the cartoon. I guess they did it to spice her up, not that she wasn't already spicy, but aren't these supposed to be more accurate to their show designs? Why the change? But that's a minor thing. The other design change you might have noticed is one of her wings looks weirdly wobbly. Oh wait, that's not a design change. That's the awful rubberized plastic that was bent out of shape, even though this was no out of the box. In fact, this whole figure feels surprisingly cheap and rubbery with surprisingly loose legs, which is weird given, again, brand new. In fact, quality control is so bad that some figures start splitting apart, as evidenced by Perspective Ends video here. Mine thankfully doesn't, but ouch. Ouch. And the articulation, which you'd expect to be great on a figure like this, is surprisingly limited. No waist pivot, no ankle pivot. You can have the upper torso go up but not down. She can't T-pose, she can't split. The knees can't go backward. I want to complain so much, except articulation is the main reason to get a figure like this. The bottom feels especially redundant because if you look, the pieces underneath are essentially the same. All they need to do is mold some extra bits on there. Why add this rubbery bottom that limits articulation? You can take the chest piece off, even though that piece wasn't really in the way. It's a shame because, again, it actually makes sense to make non-transforming figures for designs like Prime's. The one time it actually makes sense and they still f*** it up. God, so far the best is the one from the early 90s, and that's because there was nothing else. Is there any modern non-transforming articulated figures that are worth a damn? Well, actually, yes. Say hello to Blockies, or Blokees. I'm gonna pronounce them Blokees because that's funnier.
Hello, you fucking Blokees!
Blokees are a series of blind boxes and standalone model kits produced in China and licensed by Hasbro. Like Yolo Park, they're models you have to build, and let me tell you, having instructions for building Optimus Prime's crotch gives me a certain bit of joy. As you can see, they're in that semi-exaggerated style like Action Masters and Yolo Parks, but are far, far better. And not just because it's movie 07 Prime, aka the best Optimus design ever, don't at me. Not only is the detailing a ton better, like holy crap, this is one of the most accurate movie Optimus builds I've ever seen despite the stylization, but it feels so much better to pose. Everything is so silky smooth and it's a lot more fun to pose about. The accessories are really nice with a base that allows for multiple pins throughout it for posing, fake laser waves, swords, alternate hands, and a gun. But it even comes with a gimmick. Tapping the figurine turns on a blue LED, which is pretty dang cool. And the posing on this guy is, again, unreal. This is what a non-transforming figure should be. It's at a scale that looks charming, it comes with a lot of stuff, the posing is fantastic, it feels nice, building it was good fun, it doesn't feel like it's a replacement. It's just a blast. Blokees have other figures available for other movies, G1, and 1 recently, and I'm seriously considering getting some more of them. I even already have their RC. It makes a lot more sense for me as a Transformers collector than the other ones. Not that Yolo Park was far off, but these are just so much better made. So congratulations to Blokees. You're the best in a market that probably shouldn't exist. So what did we learn? Honestly, most non-transforming figures aren't great, and you should probably go for the transforming kind. But there are good ones. The best are the ones that take advantage of the fact they don't have to worry about the transformation. So they can add things like way more articulation, detailing, better material, and even some more play features in some cases. So for me, Action Masters and Blokees easily fulfilled. Yolo Park weren't far off, but they really need to improve their quality assurance. And Red, Reaction, and whatever the hell Drift was can die! And these are just the more affordable ones. This is not even covering stuff like DLX, which straight up are trying to be figure replacements. Let me ask you something. What's the point of something that costs the same, if not more, than a Masterpiece figure or third-party Masterpiece-like figure that doesn't transform? I still feel like you should definitely go for the transforming figures if you can, but I'm not going to act like there aren't good ones out there, particularly the Blokees. However, there are people that just want the characters and don't care if they transform. Most of these I borrowed from my flatmate who doesn't even transform them. She only cares about their robot form. And more power to her. But I just feel like transforming is important to Transformers. I mean, it's in the name. But what about you? How do you feel about non-transforming Transformers? Are there any good ones? In particular, I'd love to hear the opinions of people who aren't super into Transformers. Let me know in the comments, please subscribe. Seriously, how does that work?